Okay. I think that should work. It's some time ago now since Pete and I first met. It was actually in 1976. But this is the first group photo. This is the departmental photograph for 1977. And as two new lecturers were at the back. Pete's the one on the left. I'd actually forgotten about the beard, and I wondered who it was, but Len reassured me that that is Pete. Right. Okay, so those are the days. That's Pete without the beard. That's me in the phase where I thought smoking the pipe made me look mature. We had a very quiet start. I've been working on visual cortex lesions in primates, actually. And I was interested in how lesions of visual cortex affect visual acuity in rats. And the lesions of the superior colliculus were just a kind of boring control. We knew that the colliculus gets a massive retinal input, and we also thought that it wouldn't be involved in visual acuity or pattern discrimination. And the reason for that was a paper published by Jerry Schneider in 1969 from MIT, two visual systems, which had a big impact at the time. And he used hamsters. And he found that in hamsters, although lesions of visual cortex affected pattern discrimination learning, lesions of the superior colliculus didn't. And they seemed, therefore, colliculus lesions seemed like a sensible control for the acuity study. And in fact, we found they did not. Sorry, I found, no Pete here yet, sorry. I found that SC lesions did not affect acuity. But these control rats, they just did not look normal. They seemed to be in a world of their own. They weren't frightened in open spaces by experimenters over them. They were hyperactive, but they didn't seem to be very exploratory. This picture, which isn't actually one of ours, but it captures this animal sort of just going. Its whiskers would have touched that cup, that mug, but it pays it no attention whatsoever. And I guess in sort of subjective broad terms, they seem to be robotic or solipsistic. They seem to be a world of their own. So I saw this, but what I didn't really know was this important? And this is where Pete comes in, because first of all, he'd had a wide experience of working with rats. After a variety of treatments, including manipulations of the dopamine system. And he was very supportive. He said, yes, this does look like something important. And this is one of his sayings, that I don't care what the effect is, so long as it's big. And so we had a real size-based theoretical foundation for the work that followed. Slight digression, some time ago now too. This is when Kevin Connolly on the right was head of department and John Frisbee was his second in command. I think there was rather less financial pressure in the department than there is now. And rather less pressure on two new lecturers. And so it was easier to tilt at windmills in those days. Okay, where to start? The other part of Schneider's findings, that hamsters with the superior colliculus, although their pattern discrimination is intact, they don't orient to unexpected sensory stimuli. And so what Schneider argued was that the Colliculus was specifically concerned with orienting movements. But that's not quite what we found. Pete had a mastery of microinjection techniques, which allowed us to use injections of GABA agonists into Colliculus as stimulation. And what we found was that the initial and most frequently observed effects of microinjections of picrotoxin were behaviours resembling avoidance, defence, or escape. At some sites, these reactions were restricted to freezing, suppression of orientation, and an exaggerated startle reaction to sudden stimuli. But at other sites, you started to get backward shuffling, mild sensory stimulation would evoke a flinching response, and at the most sensitive sites, injections of picrotoxin caused mild stimulation to produce a violent jumping retreat. This was a robust effect. We were able to get it with Niaz-Sahibzadeh to electrical stimulation. That, okay, on the left, that's an animal moving towards where the sensory stimulation would have been, and on the right, away from it. So we've got some sites orientation, other sites backing away, and it's depended primarily on the site of stimulation, the Colliculus, as I shall mention later. So it's a robust effect, and what we found out, actually, I think a little bit later, was that at this time, a guy called Bjorn Merker was doing his thesis at MIT with Jerry Schneider as his supervisor, and he still using hamsters, but he had rather a cunning apparatus in which the animals live sort of below ground, but from time to time they're allowed up into an open arena. But they never see a human, they never see an experimenter, they never see any overhead stimuli. And one day he released a small bit of cardboard to swing above the arena when a hamster was in it. And the animals escaped explosively at the soundless appearance of the black overhead board, scrabbling to safety at maximal hamster speed, sometimes tumbling over themselves in the attempt, reminiscent of our effects with picrotoxin. If the SC is sufficiently damaged, nothing. No response. They ignore this potentially life-threatening stimulus. So Bjorn's work was a much more striking demonstration of our informal sense that these collicular animals were in a world of their own, and it fits very well with the dramatic movements we got with collicular stimulation. Meets Pete's criteria of a big effect. We never knew if Jerry Schneider did in fact agree with us. He's still around, perhaps you could ask. Okay, so that's not just orienting but defense. It's also not just orienting but something called pursuit. At some of the sites in the Colliculus of rat, electrical stimulation gives a movement, a sort of fixed amplitude movement, as if to a particular region of space defined with respect to the animal's body. And the amplitude of those movements is determined mainly by the site of stimulation, not by the stimulation characteristics. However, at other sites, we got something which looked much more as if the animal was following something. The movements lasted as long as the stimulation, so it wasn't just site-specific. And so if you kept it on long enough, you would get circling. And it was extraordinarily fast. We didn't have a very precise method of measuring velocity, but it was about twice as fast as a human cicada. So unbelievably fast. And we thought it looked as if the animal was pursuing something. And it wasn't just pursuit, there were also, you could get oral responses from stimulating the colliculus. So at some of the sites with picrotoxin after the strong defensive responses, you get gnawing, biting, chewing, licking. And we also found that, in this case, another GABA antagonist, collicular bicuculline, would actually produce orienting, but also biting. So you'd stimulate the animal's whiskers, go back, bite it. By the way, that also is not a picture from our work, but it illustrates exactly what the thing looked like. And so we wondered, okay, we've got pursuit and biting, is this some sort of prey-catching behaviour? And I think at that time we weren't really sure whether rats were predators. We had an informal observation that one day a spider got into the cage of a hungry rat, and as soon as the spider touched the rat was down, picked it up and ate it. Blink of an eye, just like that. Slightly more systematic was an ethological study of rats in a semi-naturalistic environment in Ghana. And what Ur observed was that cage-rid animals who'd no previous experience of insects responded at once to the fluttering of a moth or dragonfly. They emerged probably from the nest box, chased, captured, and devoured the prey. First acquaintance. Flights of termites, the rats would eat termites. White mouse, toads. So it's clear that rats are predators. And so the fact that collicular stimulation produces pursuit and biting could be related to prey catching. And there was a little bit more direct evidence of SC involvement. In hamsters, funny enough, not at MIT, this is Barbara Finlay, that hamsters pursue crickets, and she found that SC damage impairs pursuit of crickets in hamsters. Okay, so we tried to summarize the implications of these findings in 1989, now with collaborating with Max Westby, who was able to provide for us insights from electrophysiology. And our preliminary conclusions were that the rat superior colliculus is primarily concerned with what you might call unexpected stimuli. It has a repertoire of at least 3 responses to them: defend, predate, orient. And this increased repertoire suggested, at the time, 2 lines of research. One, it was known, the anatomy was known at the time that the colliculus has a lot of outputs. They're both ascending and descending. This is just the descending ones, and only a subset of the latter shown there. And it was a bit of a puzzle if all this structure was orienting. Why did it need so many outputs? Of course, it's much more consistent if you do have multiple responses, then you're going to need multiple output channels to mediate them. And so one of the research questions, first research questions, was which pathways mediate which responses? And this was a big question, because stimulation of the colliculus, it doesn't just produce movements. It also produces changes in blood pressure and heart rate. It can desynchronize the EEG, and it actually has anticonvulsant effects. So it's a big job, but it's helped by the fact that the output pathways are very segregated. There's a very modular organization. By this time, Peter developed anatomical track tracing skills, and he was able to show that the cells of origin of the 2 major descending pathways, the cross-descending pathway and the ipsilateral descending pathway, were largely separate. There were very, very few double-labeled cells when you put tracer into both of the pathways. So very strong output segregation. And indeed, there's similar findings for the targets within each pathway. So extreme modular organization. And the fact that you have different cells of origin meant that maps could record from them and find out how they're triggered. So for example, a cell here projecting to an area we'd implicated in defensive responses responds to overhead visual stimuli. Now this kind of finding leads to the second research question, which is how is any particular set of outputs selected? Now this always was a problem for the view that the Colliculus only did orienting because you had to decide what to orient to. But clearly this brings it much more to the fore when you have multiple possibilities. And we had some preliminary ideas. This is one of them, that this is now looking down on a dorsal view of the Colliculus. And we can look where the head movements are. And you can see that to the front and the right, you get upward head movements and downward head movements to the left and bottom. And so we can have a look and estimate where the horizontal meridian is. And then we can look, when we stimulate in the superficial areas, those sites at which we get either defense or orienting approach movements. And so what it looks like is that the rule here is that overhead stimuli elicit defense and downward stimuli give orienting and approach. So that was one rule of thumb. Another one seems to be something to do with characteristic of movement. We see from the ethological study that a certain kind of fluttering movement seems to immediately elicit pursuit, whereas it's known that looming will elicit escape and avoidance. And the third one, which is the most relevant to, I think, what other people are talking about, is what we call at the time contextual information. And in particular, it was the suggestion that the dopamine system can bias the Colliculus towards pursuit and biting. And Peter actually recognized very early the relevance of the dopamine system. And so very early on, he showed that, okay, if you give a rat apomorphine, injection of that apomorphine, if you get the dose right, you get very intense stereotype gnawing and licking. It's completely absent in animals with collicular lesions. Very striking effect. Similarly, with oral behavior that's produced by manipulating the substantia nigra. If you inhibit the substantia nigra, again you get stereotype gnawing, particularly if you give perioral stimulation, and again completely absent after animals with, in animals with SC lesions. So this suggests that the forebrain dopamine influences oral behavior via the substantia nigra and the colliculus. And so where I think we finished at that time was that in response selection there was some kind of simple decision tree. Do I make an immediate response, defend or attack? Otherwise, I orient or ignore. And we know that defense or attack can be very, very fast. They look as if some of them are genetically pre-wired, and that they're somehow controlled by the basal ganglia. And I think it was fair to say that we weren't really sure what the basal ganglia, how they did that at that stage. And I suspect that later speakers will be throwing light on this issue. But now, the Redgrave Experience. Sayings that have stayed with me since those days. The first one is, this rat's not going to seize. Doing the anticonvulsant work, we would time how long treatment took until the animal seized or didn't seize at all. And I remember the occasion we were looking at it, people saying, no, this rat's not going to seize. About 2 seconds later. But it's more general than that. I think we found over and over and over again that no matter how certain we were that something was the case, the next experiment showed us to be wrong. Never to be forgotten lesson. And I think it's all right if you tilt at windmills, provided you know when the windmill wheels. Oh yes, you must know when you can be tight and when you can be loose. This is really to do with expertise. In a sense, it's what expertise is. You know when this bit of the procedure must be done with scrupulous care, and you know when this bit it doesn't matter. And so, when we made up drug dilutions, it was a bit of a comic episode that each of us would do it independently 6 or 7 times until we got agreement. But drug dilutions are crucial to what we were doing, so we had to get it right. Dress sense, probably most of you would agree that it hasn't gone in for unnecessary formality. Students and postdocs, one thing you may have noticed is that people treat you as equals. There is no unnecessary formality there either, because that's when you don't need to be tight, you don't need to stand on unwarranted authority. Right, in the staff meetings, we got then, as what I hear you get now, let's all do some more first year tutorials. And people say, fine, what shall I stop doing? And in those days, it got laughed at in staff meetings. Maybe not so much now, work-life balance, etc., etc. But a critical question. And then jokes. Jokes. Sexual stereotypy, Scott. I can't tell it. You have to ask me. Right, enough of that. Right, okay, so the final Redgrave experience, I think this is more a feeling, but it does have some content. That I think our impression was that there could be a lot of data being used in our field, but remarkably little of it seemed relevant to what we were interested in. And actually, you can have a sense of drowning in irrelevant data. And here's a little example. This is from a textbook, an illustration of a synapse to boot on there. Okay, so that looks manageable. This is from a paper in 2014, a drawing of the same thing in which they generated a 3-dimensional model of an average synapse displaying 300,000 proteins in atomic detail. Do we need to do this? Do we need to know about 300,000 proteins? I put when things go wrong, maybe. I think I should amend that. When things go wrong, yes, because you've no idea where it's going wrong, and it could be in any one of those 300,000 proteins. You need to know about them all. But if we are studying normal function, for the moment at any rate, do we need all this? And we wondered whether the conceptual framework proposed by David Marr could be helpful. I was actually at school with David, but unfortunately didn't understand what he was saying. And it was when I got to Sheffield that John Frisbee and John Mayhew explained to us a little bit what was going on. This is very light Marr, but the idea is that any information processing task must be split into different levels, and he talks about 3. I shall only mention 2 here. The first is, what is the system trying to do? Task analysis, if you like. the computation level, what is it trying to do? And then how's it doing it? Or in the case of a biological machine, it's what is the biological machinery that's being used, what is sometimes called the implementational level. And some of the implementational details may have nothing to do with the basic computation. So, for example, a neuron has to manage its calcium levels to ensure survival, but a lot of the neuronal machinery for that is nothing to do with the particular nature of its signal processing task. And so there's a question of how do you tell when a given detail of implementation is irrelevant, and I'm hoping the subsequent speakers will answer that question. Okay, and finally, robotics. A consequence of the Marr position is that autonomous robots that face the same problems of action selection as living organisms. So despite the different implementation, we might be able to use robots to test computational predictions from experiments. And remembrance of rats' past, anticipation of rats' future. Here's a robot rat designed or built by the Bristol Robotics Laboratory in collaboration with Tony Prescott. And will this work? Will this work? Although it looks pretty basic when it's not moving, when it starts to move, it looks a little bit more meaningful. Can we test out our theories derived from studies of action selection in rats? Can we test them out by looking at action selection in a robot? Thank you.